You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get started with this week's episode, which is going to be a very good one, I would like to tell you that if you want to be an Army Ranger, or you know anybody who wants to be an Army Ranger and have that sort of career, this is a must-listen episode for anybody interested in being a Ranger or wants to know about Ranger School. This is the episode to listen to. But before we get to the episode, just a couple of quick notes. Reminder to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, subscribe on YouTube, still trying to grow that Hazard Ground community. Don't forget to check out our website, hazardground.com, and all the sponsors that we have there. During these tough times, those sponsors are helping keep this podcast afloat, so certainly check them out. We do have a partnership with Amazon, so if you're going to shop on Amazon during these trying times, make sure you go to hazardground.com first, click on the sponsor tab or the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage. Do all your normal shopping, and we'll get a percentage of what you spend, and we'll donate it right back to some of the charities you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. One final note, we often get comments, ratings, and reviews, and please leave those ratings and reviews because we love hearing from them, good, bad, or indifferent. But one review we got from a listener was sort of inspiring, and I wanted to share it with you. And this is Britt, and he says, as a 21-year-old young man who prides himself on his physical ability to push through tough situations and grind it out, this podcast is so incredibly humbling. To hear what these men have to endure and overcome inspires me to do what it takes one day to hopefully become a man that can stand amongst those heroes. I've always wanted to be a Green Beret, and this is only reaffirming my desire. Thank you for the motivation. Britt, we certainly wish you the best of luck, and thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground community and listening every single week. With all that out of the way, make sure everybody stays safe, stay healthy, and let's get on with this week's episode. Joining us this week on the Hazard Ground Podcast is the return of a former guest all the way back, episode 22. He is a former U.S. Army captain, an airborne ranger, turned author who wrote a book called The Prisoner and His Palace, who chronicled the soldiers who guarded Saddam Hussein during his time in prison in Iraq. And he joins us because of a new piece that he has just written for Outside Magazine chronicling Ranger School. He is Will Bardenwerper, joining us here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Will, welcome back and great to talk to you again.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me back on.
Okay, a lot since we last talked. Since the last time you and I were together, episode 22 was a long time ago for us. So this thing came out 2 or 3 years ago as one of the first episodes that we've ever had on the podcast. So it's great to have you back after all this time. And your book was a huge success, The Prisoner in His Palace. And we talked a lot about your journey through Iraq and your time in the service. But now we're taking a little bit of a different venture. And part of the reason why we wanted to have you back, because you are undertaking this new project to sort of chronicle Ranger School and how different it is now than what it used to be and some of the changes. And for those who don't know, again, Ranger School was a 9-week course through the mountains of Georgia, the swamps of Florida, and more, one of the most grueling military courses there is. You sort of got the opportunity to go back through Ranger School again, this time just as a journalist, being able to talk to Ranger students. And so tell me from the beginning why you wanted to undertake this whole thing.
Sure. So I begin the article and basically by saying that I consider myself fortunate in that I spent 13 months in one of the more violent parts of Iraq, Anbar province, in one of the most violent years of the conflict there, 2006. And very rarely do I have a bad dream, for example, about that experience, but that not a month goes by that I don't wake up from a nightmare, which is that I need to return to Army Ranger School. And that's a true story. And so clearly it occupies some kind of a unique place in my psyche for whatever reason. And I've always kind of been curious to sort of see behind the curtain and learn a little more about why that may be. I suspect part of it is the fact that I wasn't the world's most successful Ranger student. It certainly was not easy for me. I think I had to confront some of my own weaknesses there the same way that a lot of people do. And so I wanted to go back and kind of get a better look at what takes place. As anyone in the military knows, when you're in a school like that, you're kind of a sleep-deprived zombie, so you don't even really know what's going on. So I figured if I could go back with a fresh set of eyes, I might be able to learn something.
I'm curious, when you approached the military about being able to do this, because again, Ranger School is what it is, and it is, to a certain extent, part of the special operations community. So there's not a lot of, freedom for journalists to move within those ranks. It's one thing to cover the unit downrange, but how we go about making Rangers is still a relatively, not well-known thing. So what was their response when you told them that this is what you wanted to do?
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes the article unique. For the benefit of your readers, it's in Outside Magazine. It will. I think hard copies are available now wherever is open to buy magazines these days, right. And then the online version is going to be released, I think, on April 20th. But to answer your question, I think my access was pretty unique. I'm not aware of any other journalist essentially being allowed to show up on day one and just walk alongside the students until graduation day 9 weeks later. I think I benefited from the fact that I'd been through the school myself. There probably wouldn't have necessarily been as much trust had I been a journalist with no military experience. But I was frankly pretty amazed at the level of freedom and access I was provided. There were no kind of minders who were preventing me from observing things. I would jump onto Blackhawks alongside the students and accompany them on their missions. I went on the ruck marches. I could pretty much do what I wanted to do. I did, need to make the students that I was writing about had to sign a waiver that they were comfortable talking to me and being quoted. So, we went through a few basic formalities, but aside from that, I was given pretty much free rein.
How did you decide which students you would talk to?
So, that was an important part of the story, obviously, because I couldn't write an article about, 300 anonymous people. I wanted to bring it to life through the experiences of individuals and what they were going through and kind of bring them as people to life. And so I kind of had as a goal, I wanted to have at least someone that came from the typical demographics of Ranger School. And they are, more or less junior infantry officers, either from West Point or our OCS or ROTC. I kind of wanted to get a West Pointer in there. And then young Ranger Regiment soldiers typically go either as an E3 or an E4, and it's kind of a prerequisite to stay in the regiment that they graduate. So I wanted to find one of them. You find sort of more experienced NCOs from different combat arms units. So I wanted to get one of them, and then you have your special forces folks there as well. And in my article, I met a number of them. One of whom was in his mid 30s and had been, I think, on 7 deployments and had considerable combat experiences. But it was still not easy for him because he was going through a very physically demanding course at, about 10 years older than most of the other students that he was with. So I kind of tried to pick individuals who fit those different demographics. And then now, as you know, women can go to Ranger School. So I thought that a woman's experience would be unique and interesting as well. So that's how I did it. And then, of course, it was mutual. It wasn't just my identifying them. They had to be comfortable with me and be reasonably outspoken, and that wasn't easy either for them, because you're talking about a situation where they're on their feet, pretty busy, 21 hours a day, and in some cases, I'm sure the last thing they wanted to do was be answering questions, on top of that. So all of that kind of went into play.
Let's peel back the layers a little bit, because I really feel this is a great opportunity for anybody listening to this as sort of like a quick study up, the cliff notes of Ranger School at this point. And I hope we can get deeper into some of those conversations. So let's start at the beginning. What were some of the questions you were asking these people on day one? Did you wait for them to go through anything before you started talking to them? What did they know? How prepared did they seem to you for this whole thing?
Well, I was somewhat limited in how much I could do at the beginning, simply because, and I guess for your listeners who are less familiar with Ranger School, the first week is called RAP week, Ranger Assessment Phase. And that is when everyone kind of goes through a battery of primarily physical tasks that results in the largest amount of attrition over the course of the entire course. And so, I wasn't going to necessarily invest a ton of time on a particular soldier when I knew that that there was a 30 or 40% chance that they wouldn't be there for week number 2.
Let me interrupt one second.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because you went through this, when you were sizing up these people, the 363 of people that you may want to talk to, could you tell who was going to not make it through week 1 and who was?
No, at that point it was not necessarily evident who was going to succeed or who was going to fail. Obviously, since a lot of those week 1 events are fitness related, people who appeared to be in the best shape, I kind of assumed would probably have the least difficulty.
But that's not always the case. We know that.
But exactly. And it's certainly not. As the course went on, and I don't want to fast forward too far past that first week, but it did become more clear who the high performers kind of were, and that was one of the things I was very interested in for the article, were what are the attributes that were sort of common among those who seemed to be doing well. So I would say that by the mountain phase, which is phase number 2, the second 3 weeks of the course, I kind of had a general idea as far as who was doing very well, who was kind of on the bubble, and who was likely to come up short.
All right, so they get through that first week. When did you get to the point where you started identifying the people that you wanted to speak to?
I spent the course it's essentially 9 weeks, 3 weeks down at Fort Benning, and 3 weeks in the mountains of North Georgia, and 3 weeks in the swamps of Florida. I spent the better part of the first 3 weeks making that assessment. Who are the people that I'm really going to focus on moving forward. And so by the time we got to mountains, I had a pretty good idea of who they were going to be. And then you did allude to something earlier that might be worth touching on, which is how has the course changed? And I don't know if you wanted me to mention one or two of those right now.
No, sure, go ahead. Yeah, free flowing, let it go.
Yeah. So how it changed, because this was something I was kind of sensitive to going in, is I didn't want to be one of those people who, I know from your Army experience, there's kind of that old joke, when I did it, it was hard. And ever since then, it's gotten easier. And I think that probably dating back to the first Ranger class, the graduates from that class would say that about the second class, and the second class has said that about the third class. And it's probably been that way for as long as the course has been around. So I didn't want to be that guy. I did this 15 years ago. I did it when it was tough, and now it's gotten watered down and easy. But I think that said, there are a few changes that have been made that I don't want to say it's made it easier, and easy is certainly not the right word. It's still an incredibly difficult school. You're still not eating. You're still not sleeping. That hasn't changed really at all. I think one thing I did notice is that there is a little bit less, I guess hazing might be the word. In the Army, we would call it getting smoked, doing push-ups and flutter kicks and getting yelled at. I think part of that is kind of a consequence or a reflection of society at large. I don't think it's unique to the military. I think, you look at football, two-a-days, used to be pretty brutal, and they've kind of evolved over the years. Fraternities, hazing has been cracked down upon in that world. There's just kind of less tolerance in our society for that kind of discipline, if you want to call it that. And then also, there's the chance that the Ranger instructors just weren't, doing that when I was standing there. Who knows what was going on,
Sure, yeah.
I wasn't in all places at all times. But I did notice that, especially in that first phase, there seemed to be a little bit less of the shouting at the students and having them do push-ups and flutter kicks. It seemed like when I was there, every spare minute that we weren't engaged in a training exercise or learning something, we were on our backs or on our stomachs, getting yelled at.
Okay, just Will's opinion, good, bad, or indifferent that changed?
Relatively indifferent. I think it made it maybe a little bit, being in a constant state of even more fatigue as a result of all of those push-ups kind of did make some of the other challenges more difficult, because you enter them already in a state of kind of added stress and fatigue. I don't think it had a profound impact on things, though, to be honest. One other element, though, that changed, and really one of the only kind of substantive, benchmark events that took place that was different from when I went through it was we used to do a ruck march out to Darby, which is the camp on Fort Benning where you do your field training there. And back when I went through, it was about a 16, I think, or 17-mile march with all your gear. So, you're talking 75, 80 pounds plus weapons and ammunition and whatnot. They've replaced that now with what basically the expert infantry badge ruck march, which is I think 12 miles in under 3 hours with maybe 40 pounds or so of weight. So that is, I think, definitely not as challenging. And the reason I bring that up is not that one march is necessarily that big of a deal, but it's the cumulative effect of arriving for the 2-week field exercise with, in my case and other people's cases back then, feet that were completely torn to shreds, by this 16-mile march with a ton of weight that then made that field problem a lot more challenging. So I think it's important to remember that, these different events shouldn't be viewed in a vacuum. They all contribute in a cumulative fashion to the difficulty of the course as a whole. So that would be, I think, maybe the only sort of substantive change that I think was made that maybe made things a little bit less challenging.
What did you want to know from the students that you were interviewing during this first phase?
I wanted to determine if they'd be just reasonably, interesting people who are happy to talk. I mean, as any journalist, I think, learns, if someone's just going to give you a yes or no answer, that it's going to be very difficult to bring them to life as an interesting character. So I was just kind of getting to feel them out, hoping to develop a rapport with them. And then, again, kind of getting a sense as to what their background was, what their backstories were, and elements to that I thought made them uniquely interesting. Like I mentioned, that Special Forces soldier with the 7 deployments, I thought was that was fascinating. The female officer that I spent some time covering had been the number 1 ranked cadet from West Point that branched infantry, which was pretty remarkable. So she had kind of a unique story. She was destined to go to the 173rd Airborne Division as an infantry officer. And then there was a young man who grew up. He actually lost 2 fingers, or a part of 2 fingers, in a shop accident in high school in Louisiana. Was working at a McDonald's, and a recruiter was driving through the drive-through window and asked him one day, "Hey, do you want to join the Army?" And he said, "My dream was always to become an airborne ranger, but I can't do it because I lost part of my hand." And the recruiter said, "Hey, work with me. I'll try to get you a waiver." And it was a long road, but sure enough, he found himself in the Ranger Regiment and in Ranger School, minus a part of 2 fingers. So I was looking for just interesting stories, I guess, from the different people that I was meeting with.
I do want to get into the female later on, because there's a whole bunch of different layers of questions that I want to ask there, because I've talked to a lot of females on the podcast and their thoughts about these roles that women have expanded to, but I just want to put that on pause. I don't want to think the listeners I'm glossing over it, but you were someone who, when you went to Ranger School, struggled and you wanted to quit and you didn't, and to your credit, you stayed through it. When you're watching some of these Ranger students go through this, what sort of thoughts were coming back to your mind, and could you tell who the ones were who wanted to quit?
I could in some cases, and it was humbling to me, to be honest, because when I looked at some of those particularly strong performers, I thought to myself, man, I don't want to say they were making it look easy, but they certainly weren't having as tough a time as I recalled having. And so that kind of made me even more curious. What is it about them that is enabling them to enjoy this kind of success? And I don't think it was physical, because I was in pretty good shape at the time. And some of these high performers weren't necessarily, what we would call in the Army, PT studs. They weren't physical specimens necessarily. So I figured there has to be something else to it that is enabling them to do so well. And what I kind of gradually concluded was that it was the ability to always be externally focused on helping the team rather than sort of internally focused on their own discomfort, I guess, or their own misery. or even just looking at it more. I think I was maybe looking at it more as an individual challenge to compete and beat people, as opposed to we're all in this together. We're all going to succeed or fail as a group. And I remember the battalion commander of the Fort Benning phase, 4th Ranger Training Battalion. He gave a little talk to the students when the class started, and he said that unlike a lot of other military schools, or the more demanding schools, there's only three or 4 days here that are individual assessments, and that's that first week that I mentioned. After that, the remaining 50-something days, you're going to succeed or fail based on your ability to be a good leader and a good follower and a good teammate. And I don't think I ever fully appreciated that when I was there, but watching it really drove home the fact that he was absolutely right about that.
See, it's interesting you bring that up because, and I just look at myself, and again, I didn't go to Ranger school, but I would tell you, I don't think I would have made it as a lieutenant. In fact, I don't think I would have made it prior to my first deployment. And I don't think I would have made it because that wasn't anything I really could comprehend early on in my military career. I didn't comprehend the idea of what it means to be part of a team until after my first deployment. Because everything we go to, especially in the officer side of the house, in officer training, it is very individualized because they want you to be an individual leader. That's what they're training you to be, right? Stand up in front of the formation, understand who does what role, understand how to command them, understand how to speak with them, understand how to get everybody together to do their job. And you're evaluated on your abilities alone to get other people to do things for you because you are the officer in charge. That's not the case when you're in that environment. I feel like I am much better equipped, even though physically right now I don't know if my body can handle it, but mentally I would be much better equipped to handle Ranger School at this point in my career than I ever would have as a first or second lieutenant or even a young captain. So to that end, I ask you, when you look at these E3s and E4s and these fresh out of West Point lieutenants and everything else, are they able to recognize that, and can you see them struggle with it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. I'm the exact same as you. I think physically now it would be a lot more challenging, but I think the mental side, I would have a much better appreciation of that dynamic. Looking at the young students, I don't know how much of that was learned or how much of that was just kind of an innate, leadership trait that maybe can't be taught, that they just understood, better than maybe other people understand it. That's a good question. I do think though that not only did it benefit them as far as, they're going to be assessed as a more effective leader when they're always doing a good job helping out the team, but another element to it is it even helped them as individuals because it takes you out of your own head, and by becoming engaged and picking other people up, you have less time to devote to your own discomfort, because you're rather than just pulling security on the perimeter and being upset at how cold and hungry you are, you're helping with the terrain model, or you're helping someone do an op order, or you're active, and it keeps you engaged, and I think it actually helped them as much as it helped the unit as a whole.
And I think the other piece of that, at least, for me, I'm just talking about myself, I would be more concerned with other people not failing than my passing. Like I would make sure other people finished, even if it meant that I would fail if it was a timed exercise. Like just because I understand that concept better now, later in my career than I ever did before. So I just look at that and I go, well, look, if I can make somebody else pass, even if I fail, then I'm helping out the good of the group, and that person's a better person than I am. So let them continue on while I don't. I mean, that's that psyche is just different.
And that's exactly right too. And I saw that a lot. I saw the strong performers come together, and so for the listeners who aren't as familiar with how it works, you essentially need to get what they call a go on a leadership billet on a patrol to pass each phase. So you need to get one go in Benning, and one go in Mountains, and one go in Florida, and you might get 2, maybe 3 leadership opportunities in order to earn that go. And so what you would see sometimes would be the strong performers might get a go right off the bat, on the first day or two of a field problem. And then towards the end, the leaders would sometimes be folks who it was their second or third chance, and if they didn't get a go, they'd either get recycled or dropped out of the course. And so you would see sometimes the strong performers sort of band together and say, listen, we really like this guy. He's working his ass off, but he hasn't gotten his go yet. So let's pick him up and help get him across the finish line. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't, but you did see some good teamwork. On the flip side of that, sometimes you saw some guy that just was not carrying his weight, not doing a good job, not a good team player, and I don't want to say that the rest of the squad would kind of hang him out to dry, but they wouldn't necessarily feel quite as energized to help him succeed because, quite frankly, he probably shouldn't succeed.
Any difference between officers and enlisted that you could notice?
I mean, in general, I would say that officers are expected to be a little bit more polished when it comes to the planning process, because even though they're young officers, they've had at least some training on how to deliver, a platoon operations order, for example.
Yeah, because you did it for 4 years in ROTC at West Point. You better get it right.
So exactly. So, you see a little bit of that, whereas I think the expectations for, an E3 to do a platoon op order wouldn't be the same. So, I mean, there are different things that you're expected to be good at. I mean, I think to some extent, tactically, a younger soldier with maybe a deployment under his belt would be expected to be tactically more proficient, because they've actually done it in real life. So, even though the Ranger instructors kind of have a standardized, scorecard, so to speak, they're looking for they understand who these guys are and what their backgrounds are, and are looking for them to be, more proficient at some things than others. And I think the other thing I should also mention, though, is the fact that it's not a perfect science, and I hope that comes through in the article. There are certainly very hardworking, talented, driven students who do not pass for sometimes reasons that are outside their control. And then by the same token, there's, some students who will graduate who may not be the world's, best soldier or officer. I mean, it's just the nature of the course. I mentioned in the article, it's certainly a lot easier to pass your leadership patrol if it's on the first day of a field exercise when everyone's rested and you have strong squad leaders, than it is on, the ninth day of a field exercise when no one has slept for 9 days and you're cold and wet and hungry and you have weak squad leaders. And so, it's not, the hope I think is that over the course of 9 weeks, it'll all even out, but it doesn't always even out. And so I don't want to be one of those people who kind of, look, and you do see this in the military where you kind of look at someone's shoulder and you see if they have a tab or not, and you make an instant determination as far as their quality, because I don't think that's fair.
You hinted on something a couple of times that is worth noting for people who aren't familiar with Ranger School, but there are peer evaluations, and you can get peered out. When did you see the first iteration of these and sort of your reactions to it?
Yeah, I mean, they're tough to watch, to be honest, because
why?
They take place at the end of each of the phases, after the field exercise is complete and before the students learn, whether they'll be moving on to the next phase. And basically how it works is they sit down a squad of 10 to 15 soldiers, and you rate your colleagues 1 through 15. And I don't know the exact formula that's used, but if you're rated low enough by enough of your peers, you can get dropped from the course, or you can, or you may recycle the phase. And even that, I think it's certainly a valuable system because it keeps people honest, and it's just another element to kind of coming up with a way to assess these guys. But even that isn't necessarily perfect because there can be different cliques that form within a squad. I remember when I went through, for whatever reason, it seemed like there were 4 or 5 guys that all kind of knew each other from the same unit. And of course, they kind of come in with an understanding of how to game the system, by voting for each other, on top of potentially, guys that they didn't know beforehand. So even that one, I think, is subject to a little bit of, lack of precision. But I think overall, it's certainly a good additional metric to use.
All right, so we get past phase 1 at Fort Benning and heading into phase 2, mountain phase. What are you starting to notice as you get to phase 2 about the people you're talking to? Demeanor-wise, energy-wise, obviously it's down, but are you starting to see differences in their personality? Are they starting to get grumpy? I mean, kind of take me through the maturation of this.
Sure. So what I began to notice was the students were really starting to get beat up. I think most of them would admit that Benin, the movements were not super challenging. The terrain was, relatively flat. It didn't really, I think, destroy them physically. When they got up into the mountains of Georgia, lugging that 100-pound ruck up and down the Tennessee Valley Divide, the nights there got very cold, dipping down to below freezing some nights with some pretty harsh winds. At this point, they've now been at this for 3 or 4 weeks. At no point had they gotten probably more than maybe 4 or 5 hours sleep, and often just maybe 1 to 2 hours of sleep out just on the ground, in whatever elements they were experiencing. So I mean, their uniforms are starting to fray and kind of fall apart. They've lost weight. Tempers are starting to flare a little bit. If there's a poor performer who they feel hasn't been pulling his or her weight. By the same token, that at that point, I think some of the standout students had begun to kind of, establish themselves. I kind of had a good idea by that point who seemed to be doing pretty well. So I think that was when it started to kind of become clear who's really struggling, who's doing well, and kind of the big group in the middle who are just kind of trying to get through it one day at a time. How
is the female doing by phase 2?
She was a very strong performer. If my memory is correct, she I think she told me she barely passed one of the physical events on the first week. So she literally almost had to go home right off the bat. But once she got past that, she was one of those people that really did a good job at always helping the team. As an officer, one of the things that she excelled at was the operations order process, like I mentioned before. So if it was a young soldier, young enlisted guy that was responsible for that, she could lend him a hand and help, kind of square him away. And that was, again, that's kind of how the school works. Everyone kind of tries to figure out what is my how am I uniquely qualified to help the group? If you're a big, former, linebacker on a football team, maybe you carry the 240 or you carry a heavy weapon, more than other people because you're just a big, strong guy. If you are great at giving an operations order, that's where you kind of try to chip in. But it's important to at least figure something out that you're good at so that you're not just dead weight.
I only asked that about the female just because physically there's less of her, right? Like you talk about some of these guys who come in at 200 plus pounds and they lose 30, 40 pounds. Even if she comes in at 160 and she loses 30 pounds, I mean, that's a good chunk of her body weight that's gone. So I just didn't know physically if she was breaking down faster than some of the guys.
Yeah. I in this particular, there were a few females actually that I spent some time with, but the one who features most prominently in my article, she was a small woman. I mean, I don't remember what she told me what she weighed, but it couldn't be more than maybe 115, 120 pounds. And she's carrying a ruck
that's half her weight easily.
No, more than half.
More than half, yeah.
When there was one day where she was carrying the full ruck plus what they call a skedco, which is kind of a sled that you use to help medically evacuate someone by dragging them away from whatever happened. It had to have been pushing 100 pounds, 90 plus pounds. So you're talking that would be the equivalent of if I was carrying a ruck that was 200 pounds. You know what I mean?
Sure,
yeah. How she did that is pretty remarkable. And then there's some smaller framed guys as well, and it's definitely harder. I mean, if you're carrying a ruck that's half your weight, it's harder than carrying one that's a quarter your weight.
Could you tell any friction between any of the males and the females, or could you see any sort of guys gravitating towards the females who were experienced and could offer something that they could learn from? Was there any of that?
In my instance, the females I dealt with were kind of incorporated pretty seamlessly. I have to say, I expected it to kind of be more I guess, awkward, especially given the fact that you're out in the field for days at a time. They're going to the bathroom in a slit trench all together. I mean, there really were not a lot of accommodations, made depending on your gender. Now, I qualify that by saying that the females I was observing tended to be the high performing ones. So had I been in a platoon or a company with females that were really struggling, and there certainly are females that struggle, just like there's males that struggle, it may have been different. I don't know how that dynamic would have worked, but I think the fact the ones I was observing were doing well, led to the fact that, they kind of were just one of the guys, so to speak.
Hey everyone, just a quick break from the pod to tell you about my front page story. Looking for that perfect Mother's Day gift, or really for anybody in your life, especially parents or grandparents whom you can't go to visit these days? Check out myfrontpagestory.com. You'll talk to a professional writer about your mom, your wife, grandmother, whomever it is for 10 to 15 minutes, and they will write the most incredible story about her or that person. There's something really amazing about saying to somebody, I wanted to do something special and unique for you, so I had a story written all about you. My front page story makes it look like an actual front page on a local newspaper, framed and represents a lifetime keepsake that you'll put up in your house immediately. It's incredibly emotional for them because they get to read the quotes from you in print that say things like, I can never thank you enough, I wouldn't be who I am today without you, you are the most important person in my life. It just seems to hit different when they read it in that form. The bottom line is, she'll cry happy tears and you'll win. So go to myfrontpagestory.com and put in the code HazardGround20. That's myfrontpagestory.com and the code HazardGround20, capital H, capital G, HazardGround20 to receive 20% off of whatever story you buy. Again, My Front Page Story, it's an amazing gift that your loved one will truly cherish for the rest of their lives. Now back to the Hazard Ground podcast. Sort of tangentially here, you had talked about at the beginning when we first started talking that, you don't have nightmares about Iraq and the things that you went through there all that often, but you do often find yourself floating back to Ranger School. What was going on in your mind? Were you having sort of any Ranger School PTSD, if you will, going through all this?
When I was there, I didn't. I think if anything, it was kind of cathartic because I realized maybe that it wasn't what I necessarily remembered it as. I think what was bothering me about it was just the fact that I'm a pretty hardworking person. I like to think I'm successful at most things I set my mind to. And this was the one thing in my life that I just really feel like, I'm certainly proud that I didn't quit. I'm proud that I graduated, but I feel like it really did kind of kick my ass. and there aren't many things that have done that. And so I think it just always bothered me, why did I have such a hard time with this? And so that's kind of what I tried to explore, as I had the opportunity to watch it a second time.
By this time in Mountain Face, you had to have seen people either get recycled, quit, or get dropped from the course.
Yeah.
Any sort of surprises that you can recall? Any sort of things that stand out to you about those individuals?
Yeah, I mean, there were people. It was interesting. There were people who, in some cases, it was pretty obvious. You could just tell the guy was just not doing well. He was physically beat down. He was his leadership roles were pretty abysmal. It was just not a big surprise when they didn't advance. But there were some instances where someone actually appeared to be kind of doing well, and then they kind of just fell off a cliff, so to speak. And I think that was partly physical, maybe partly psychological. One of the other, almost every single person I asked, is the physical part harder or the mental part harder, would say it was the mental part. They would say that, just putting one foot in front of the other physically is not impossible, but your mind starts playing tricks on you, especially knowing that you can quit at any time. And then the recycle element to the course, the fact that you will be forced to repeat a phase. And in this case, it meant you had to wait about 4 or 5 weeks before you could pick back up with the next class. That was, I think, tremendously difficult mentally for some of them. because it just meant that it was 4 or 5 more weeks of not being with your family, not being with your friends, kind of just being in like a minimum security prison. And they knew that at any moment they could raise their hand and they could be home, in 24 hours. So I think that weighed on some of them psychologically.
Did you see anybody do that? Just raise their hand and go, all right, I quit, I'm out?
Yeah. I mean, it didn't happen as much as I frankly expected it to.
Did you get a chance to talk to him at all or no?
Yeah, I mean, I one student, for example, he had already recycled once, and so he went to mountains and then was going to have to recycle again. So at this point, he had been in Ranger school for 1, 2, 3, 4 months, and he still had to redo mountains, and then if he was fortunate enough to pass mountains, had to go down to Florida. So you're talking about 6 months of his life of basically not sleeping and not eating and being treated, like garbage. And it so happened that his best friend, I think, was getting married. He was supposed to be the best man in the wedding, and he just said, what, screw it. He's like, I've put my life on hold for too long. As much as I want to graduate from this place, there's other important things that I want to be doing. I didn't counsel him. That's not my job. He just kind of confided that in me. And I said, what, do what you have to do. I mentioned the fact that one of the best officers I ever served with never got his Ranger tab, so, I was just trying to kind of pick him up. He had already made his decision. I think he already had actually quit. And he was just kind of telling me why I shouldn't expect to see him around anymore.
Well, since everybody listening to this is thinking it, and I'll just ask it, how much shame is there in dropping out of this course?
I think certainly quitting is frowned upon a lot more than just giving your best and failing. So if you go through it and you just, for whatever reason, come up one push-up short, or, you don't pass your patrols, but you give it your all, I don't want to say I will say, I don't think anyone would say there's any shame in that. I do think that especially, in the infantry world, in the combat world, quitting something, barring any kind of, just extreme reason, like, the death of a parent or a sibling or, family issues. I mean, everyone understands that those things happen, but just quitting because you're cold and tired, I don't think reflects well on you, because you're going to be potentially cold and tired in combat, and people's lives are in the balance. And I think the theory is that if you can't withstand that kind of stress in peacetime, in Georgia, how are you going to be doing, at 10,000 feet in the mountains of Afghanistan? So yeah, I think it's something that people need to think carefully about. The chaplain in the mountains made a really good point in one of the services to the students. He said, that the day what did he say? He said that the day after you quit and you get a good night's sleep at home, you're going to regret having quit for the rest of your life. So basically, don't succumb to that hunger for sleep or for food, because as soon as you scratch that itch, you'll then wonder why you did what you did.
Yeah, that's probably what would keep most people up at night, to say the least, because you think about it and you go, you know what, I could have done it. And the regret probably consumes you to a certain extent. All right, you get to final phase here. Can you tell that anybody, once you get to swamp phase down in Florida, do they feel like the finish line is there? Like, are you starting to see people sort of get re-energized, or is it just a bunch of zombies at this point?
Yeah, no, I'll have to say, I don't want to mislead anyone. I did go home because I have a family in Colorado. Yeah. So, and the first few days of each phase are not particularly interesting from my standpoint, because I don't want to say they're classroom learning, but they're blocks of instruction that you then are expected to learn and put into practice when you do your field problems. So there wasn't a whole lot for me to do the first few days of each phase. So I took that as a chance to go home and check on my family. So what I'll tell you is, when I left mountains and I flew back to Denver and spent a few days with my wife and my son, and then when I got back to Florida and picked back up with the class as they began their field problem there, they definitely had a bounce in their step. They looked like they had eaten a little bit. They were a little more well rested, because the first few days of sort of classroom instruction, you sleep in a barracks. You might get 4 or 5 hours sleep indoors as opposed to 1 or 2 hours sleep out in the mud. And like you said, you can see the finish line. I think that's why, at least for me, with each passing phase, it became a little easier because you're that much closer to the end. And by then, I think they had some degree of confidence. Hey, I can do this. I've already gotten a go on 2 patrols at this point, so it stands to reason I can get another go. And so, yeah, I think that overall, for most of them, they were energized by that fact.
What was the one thing about this final phase that stood out to you the most? Was there a particular student who was there that you didn't expect to see, or that sort of, jarred your memory about something?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few students who had just been in the course for just a phenomenally long amount of time. Guys who had recycled every phase, and so they're going on. I think one was like 150 days of Ranger School or something, which is just something that I can't even wrap my mind around. And I give them, I tell a lot of people, I think that it's physically harder to go straight through, for 63 straight days, because without recycling. Just because of the cumulative wear and tear in your body. But I think mentally, the students and I recycled 1 phase, but the students who recycle 1, if not more phases, mentally, it's a lot more challenging, just because they're there for so long and they're away from regular life for so long. And they're just doing very challenging things for so long that it's got to be tremendously difficult. So I kind of had a very real admiration for their persistence, that they were still going at it. One of the students had written in his patrol cap as kind of a little motivational slogan: "Remember the little things." Appreciate an hour of sleep, appreciate an MRE, a letter from home, and I think that's one of the lessons that I took with me to this day. Is to this day, if there's a rainstorm outside and I'm inside, in a warm bed, I'm grateful. I have a roof over my head. I'm warm. I have a hot shower. I have food. It gives you, I think, a much heightened appreciation for the things that most of us, take for granted.
When you watch the whole process from start to finish, do you feel like watching it from a spectator's point of view enlightens you to something that you didn't see as you were going through it?
Yes. I think one thing that jumped out at me was the quality of the instructors. And I think that's twofold. I think when you're a student, you're always going to be predisposed to kind of think the worst of these guys that are yelling at you and giving you a hard time. And, just to think that they're just a bunch of, crazy sadists. When in fact, getting to know them and watching them operate and watching what motivates them, I had much more of a respect for their professionalism and for their motivation to teach these students as much as they could. I do think, but I'll add that I think the quality of the instruction may have improved from when I went through. And the reason I say that is that nowadays, just about every Ranger instructor has been to combat, because you're talking about an Army that's been at war for close to 20 years. And these guys have been in the Army for, at least, their E5s, E6s, and higher. So they've been in the Army for long enough that they've deployed. And so whereas when I went through, it was 2004. And so there was still a handful that had not been to combat. And the reason I think that is important is that reality, I think, gave them a real appreciation for the importance of what they're doing. We're not just here to, get our kicks, making guys crawl through the mud and do push-ups. We're here to keep these guys alive and to teach these guys skills that will keep their soldiers alive. And so I think I had a much better recognition and appreciation for the instruction side of it than I did when I was a student.
Give me 2 or 3 adjectives, or just what makes a good Ranger instructor.
I think fairness. So not playing favorites. I even found myself kind of rooting for certain students that I had gotten to know, and wanting them to succeed. And in some cases they came up short, and I was conflicted because I was like, shoot, I really kind of had hoped this guy would make it. I learned about the person, I learned about their family, I learned about why they were motivated to go through this. And it was, I didn't enjoy watching them not succeed. And so I think the instructors, though, they can't look at it that way. I mean, they have to do what's best for the Army. So that would be one thing, just fairness, not giving preferential treatment to officers or to enlisted or to guys that may be from your unit or from your hometown or whatever the case may be. What else would I say? And then, just an understanding of the importance of this. One of the instructors said to me, listen, he's like, I don't take any pleasure in failing any student. I don't enjoy that. But he said, I have to go into this with the understanding that this officer or this NCO could be leading my own son in combat one day, and it would be a disservice to the Army and to the soldiers under him or her to put a tab on someone's shoulder if they don't deserve it. And so I think that awareness is what was shared by the instructor, the good instructors that I saw.
You have a relationship with another Hazard Ground guest, Joe Quinn, who I bring this up because I respect the hell out of Joe, and he used to be the director of the Headstrong Project. He's actually just left that role. And for those who don't know Joe Quinn's story, obviously he was a previous guest on the podcast, but his brother Jimmy was killed on 9/11 in the World Trade Center. But one of your friends who ended up going through Ranger School kind of had a connection to Jimmy and Joe Quinn as well.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. It was a bizarre experience. I was driving through Nebraska on my way to do a different journalism project, and I remembered I had one phone interview that I hadn't yet done for this article that was almost finished, and I called this guy, and at the time I actually didn't know him. He was introduced to me by a friend, and so I called him, and I just kind of had the generic Ranger School questions that I had been asking a lot of Ranger School alums. And my final question was, how did you motivate yourself through the tough times? And he paused, and I didn't really know what was going on, and then it kind of became clear to me that he was a little bit choked up, but I didn't know why, because it was a pretty innocuous question. It wasn't a question that I thought was particularly, emotional or sensitive. And he said that he wrote on his patrol cap the initials JQ for Jimmy Quinn, and that he was friends with Joe and with Jimmy from childhood. And Jimmy, of course, he perished on 9/11, and he basically would always look at that cap in moments of where it was particularly tough, and he'd remind himself, hey, there's a bigger purpose to all this. This is why I'm here. I'm still alive. I'm still kicking. I'm still fighting. How can it be that bad? In light of what's happened to some other people, that we know. And so, so then we got to talking about my friendship with Joe, who I actually was just talking to today, as a matter of fact. It's just funny. It's a small world. And that whole conversation took place as I was on the side of a highway in the middle of a Nebraska cornfield, and I certainly didn't expect to be talking about that then.
Yeah, as big as the Army it is, everybody knows everybody somehow. It's weird like that. When you watch these kids graduate, when you watch these students graduate, shouldn't even call them kids, but what do you take in those moments? What sort of things were you talking to them about?
I mean, I was happy for them. I mean, I had seen how tough it was and what they had gone through, and it was great to see them with their, reunited with their families and their spouses and their loved ones, and I shared in that kind of positive mood. I I was a little more depressed when I thought back to the fact that it was 15 years since I had graduated. It felt like maybe it had been about 3 or 4 years. And, they kind of look at me now like an old man, and I certainly don't like to think of myself as an old man. But when I step back, I realize, holy cow, 15 years, that went by fast. So, there was a little bit, I guess, of, melancholy associated with that awareness. But no, I was happy for him. It was great to see him, having such a good time. And it was a good day.
What was one thing that somebody said to you who graduated that stood out to you?
Just how I was pretty flattered by, how so many of them said that they were grateful that I did what I did and that I was telling, their story. At the beginning, I was kind of afraid that I would just be kind of a nuisance, like this reporter that's hanging around. And they probably honestly did look at me that way for a little while before they, hopefully got to know me a little bit. But I think as the course went on, they realized, I didn't just parachute in there for a day. I was walking through the swamps with them. I was sleeping outside with them some of the nights. I'd usually go to the Ranger Instructor fire, so it wasn't quite the same. We'd stay warm while they're freezing nearby. But no, I think I kind of maybe earned a little bit of their respect for subjecting myself to some of the same discomfort. And so I was flattered, and I think a part of them, I think to some extent, as the course wore on, they maybe even, enjoyed the opportunity to talk with me a little bit, because it could kind of take them out of the daily grind of everything else they were doing. It was, something a little different, that was maybe a welcome distraction, so to speak.
Do you get a sense that the RIs, the Ranger instructors, when they watch those kids graduate, take pride in knowing that they help train some of the finest soldiers in the world?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, in particular, I had 2 RIs. I'll give them a shout out: Staff Sergeant Ovid and Sergeant First Class Hampton, and their job. Each Ranger course, they identify 2 RIs who shadow the class from start to finish, and usually they're kind of supposed to be like the eyes and ears of the brigade commander, and they're usually looking at particular things that he wants them to look at and kind of report back on at the end. But in this case, their additional duty was kind of just to babysit me and make sure that I had what I needed. So I got to know them very well, because they were kind of with me every step of the way on the same patrols. And no, there's no doubt that, through their eyes and through the eyes of the other instructors, they take the job seriously, and they take pride in, seeing these young men and women, graduate and go back out into the force.
They started with 360 plus students. When they graduate, how many are left?
I don't. It's in the article. I don't have the number at the top of my head. I will say though that there were 60 something who went straight through without recycling. So, that's a pretty small fraction of the beginning numbers that make it through without recycling.
Pretty impressive stuff. How much catharsis was there in this for you?
For whatever reason, there was something, because I don't think I've had one of those nightmares since. So I don't know if it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. I got to see Oz, and it kind of put it to rest once and for all. But no, yeah, I haven't, like I said, I haven't had a bad dream since. Knock on wood, that'll continue.
What would you tell somebody who wants to go to Ranger School after this project, sort of, that you didn't know before? Like, if I would have asked Will Bardenwerper a year ago, how do I survive Ranger School, would the answer be different now?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think the simple one is just don't quit. It's easier said than done. But connected to that is to understand the fact that, when you're there, and especially if you recycle, you kind of have this idea that the whole world is passing you by. I'm here, I'm missing this party if you're a young guy, or I'm missing the Super Bowl, or I'm missing my wife or my girlfriend, or just any number of things that are going on in the outside world. You feel like you're missing them. You'll never get that chance back, and that and that's what then leads that's kind of that little devil in your ear that is trying to entice you to quit. Hey, I could get back to that if I just quit. I think what I would tell someone is, you're not missing as much as you think. This is going to be over, whether it's a month or 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. That time goes by in the blink of an eye in the outside world, and there's nothing going on in the outside world that's that important, and that you're not going to be able to catch up on pretty quickly as soon as you graduate. And the regret that you'll feel by quitting will far outweigh any short-term happiness you get out of whatever it was that you felt like you were missing. I think that would be an important element of the advice. And then obviously being a good teammate and helping other people, like we talked about before, would be the other piece of it. Any
nostalgia for you?
Nostalgia? No, I think every step of the way, I was just glad that I wasn't going through what they were going through. When they're doing their patrol base at night and they're freezing their ass off and they're hungry, I'd go and have a candy bar and sit by the fire. So I definitely enjoyed every minute of that.
Is there the same camaraderie between Ranger students now as there was when you went through it? Is it different? How has it changed?
I don't know if camaraderie is the right word, because there's so many different elements of it. I would say there's a pretty good camaraderie among the high achievers. But there's some kind of awkward sort of the Lord of the Flies kind of stuff too when it comes to the lesser achievers. And so I don't there certainly are there can be friction, if some people are working especially hard and giving 110%, and then there's someone who's really not pulling their weight. I don't know if camaraderie would necessarily be the right word, but certainly on graduation day, among the people that went through it together, there is a bond there that is pretty strong, I think.
All right. In closing on this Ranger School article that you wrote, what are your takeaways from it? I mean, when you set out to do it, did you accomplish everything that you wanted to in writing this piece?
I think so. I mean, I think I'd like to think it turned out pretty well. And I mean, I think one of the things I was hoping to do would be to communicate to like the outside magazines who I wrote it for, to their readers, many of whom, if not most of whom, have not been in the military, what this is all about, and to give them an idea of what kinds of sacrifices young men and women are experiencing, essentially on behalf of all Americans, that kind of goes on in anonymity. I mean, there's some recognition of what people are doing overseas when they're deployed. But I mean, even back home, there's people who are sacrificing a heck of a lot of their own, creature comforts and happiness, on behalf of their country. And I think that it's useful for people to be reminded of that once in a while.
Again, the article is an Outside magazine. It is out if you can pick it up right now, given all that's going on in the world. But again, the online version will be released on April 20th. So make sure you guys check that out. I will ask you about one more project that you're working on. For those who know me and follow me, outside of doing the military thing and this podcast, I'm also a sports talk radio host here in Atlanta. But you are now undertaking a sports project as well. And you are now commissioned to write another book. Is it? Am I correct on that?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and it's about minor league baseball, right?
Yeah, it's now, like everything else in the world, it's been thrown into some disarray now that we are, not even
without
sure.
minor league baseball.
When we may even have a baseball season this summer, but hopefully we will. I'm still optimistic that we'll get on the field, hopefully sooner rather than later. But should we be fortunate enough to have a season, there are certain minor league teams who have been slated for elimination by Major League Baseball. And so these negotiations are ongoing, but it's looking increasingly likely that a few entire leagues may be eliminated, one of which is the Appalachian League, which is in West Virginia, Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. It's over 100 years old. It has an incredibly rich history, and the teams, play a very important role in these communities dating back quite a while. And so the book will essentially be an account of what could be the final season of baseball in places where baseball has a historic presence. And it's also just going to explore the connection between these towns and these teams. And so I'm looking forward to hopefully getting out there this summer and spending some time with a few of these teams and telling their stories.
After doing so much military writing, are you excited for a new project?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. In this case, it won't involve, sleeping out on the side of a mountain in 30-degree weather. You'll
just be riding a lot of buses in minor league baseball.
Yeah, I'll sit in the buses, but then during the game, I can sit there with a beer and a hot dog. So I think it'll be fun. I've already been lucky enough to talk with some really interesting characters from this world. I'm pretty optimistic that it'll be a cool project.
Well, it's always great to catch up, man. I love this new project that you're working on for minor league baseball, but certainly for anybody who is interested in Ranger School, for anybody who's interested in the military, the piece in Outside Magazine on Ranger School, one of the more riveting things I've read through, and certainly just a very firsthand account, as much as you can get from somebody who not only went through it, but the people that you talk to really kind of fill in a lot of the blanks. So just excellent work, man. I really, really think it's fantastic.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, Bardenwerper, as always, welcome here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.